Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending today's webinar. I am super excited to talk to you today about the 7 phases to conducting a workplace investigation. Want to go over some quick housekeeping stuff before we get started. Today's webinar is going to be about an hour in length. We're going to start off with about 45 minutes of content and end the webinar with 15 minutes of questions and answers. All of your phone lines are muted, so if you have any questions, please type them in using the questions or chat. You can feel free to type those questions in at any time, and we will address those at the end Q&A portion of the webinar. You will receive a presentation following the webinar a couple days after, along with some additional resources. And we do welcome your feedback, so please take a moment at the end of the webinar to respond to our post-webinar survey. My name is Autumn Lowry, and I've been working as a manager of professional services and behavior science specialist for Convercent for about the past 7 years. I received my bachelor's degree from Illinois State University and my master's degree locally at University of Denver in forensic psychology. Prior to working here at Convercent, I did conduct psychological assessments for criminals, did a brief time interviewing folks in jail, and soon stumbled onto this unique opportunity to work for Convercent. In my role at Convercent, I do have a unique overlap using skills in law, business, as well as psychology. My area of expertise include conducting corporate investigations on topics related to ethical conduct, retaliation, fraud, discrimination. I also conduct threat assessments for workplace violence incidents and corporate trainings on a variety of different topics. Convercent is a technology company. We're based in Denver, Colorado. We provide easy-to-use ethics and compliance software that gives you predictive analytics to mitigate people risk and safeguard your reputation. Convercent serves customers ranging from large corporations to fast-growing small companies with operations in over 130 countries and across a variety of industries. So let's go ahead and get started with today's webinar. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning briefly discussing why it's important to have an investigative process coupled with competent technology. We'll then spend the majority of the webinar examining in detail the 7 phases of investigation. And by the end of the presentation, you should be able to take the information that we've taught you, coupled with your own skills and experience, to implement your own investigative process within your organization. Convercent believes that you can keep employees engaged and focused on their responsibilities by using process and technology. Technology can help you communicate with your employees and manage your processes so that you spend less time putting out fires and more time promoting your company ethics and values. The process of investigation is a proprietary method that was developed by Convercent's Chief Ethics Officer, Eugene Ferraro. It does take a phasal approach that unfolds incrementally, and today we'll spend a lot of time dissecting each of those 7 phases. First, let's chat a little bit about the investigative process. It is important to have a process and to have it documented. Some of you attending today's webinar may already have a documented process. I encourage you to take all the information that we share, take it back to your organization, compare it to what you have, and see if there's any opportunities for improvement. I would assume that the majority of you probably don't have a documented process, but maybe have some kind of internal, informal protocols that you follow. So hopefully this webinar will give you enough information to take your informal process, couple it with the phases that we use, and really get something concretely documented to ensure that everyone's following it consistently. The benefits of having that documented process is to have consistent level of effort from everyone on your team. More importantly, it can decrease your liability in the case that any of your investigations get taken to litigation. Having an investigative process establishes a good faith investigation, which is part of the standard of proof that courts are looking for when these types of cases go to litigation. So just having something documented in place is already going to put you ahead of the game. The process does need to be structured enough to give direction to your team members, but it has to be generalized so that individuals can adjust for certain circumstances. There will always be something that comes up out of the ordinary, so we want to make sure that our process allows for you to make those discretionary calls. When we document our process, ideally documenting it electronically is going to be favored. Some of the things you want to think about that should be documented throughout the process is how your complaints are received. Whether your complaints are coming through a hotline, walking into HR's office, being reported up through management, all of those reports should be placed into one system so that you can manage all that information consistently across the board. You also want to document how those cases are going to be assigned, depending on what kind of case it is, what department it's going to go to. You want to have some kind of general timelines documented. So for certain types of investigations, they should take approximately 1 week, maybe 2 to 4 weeks, and kind of put different levels of investigations in different buckets. The process should outline your general steps to approaching an investigation, so general things that you need to do in every investigation, and how are you going to follow up with those individuals that were most involved. Technology can help make this easy for a team to follow the process, especially when you have some kind of integrated system. It will allow you to enter information into a case management system and then run reports on that case management system to ensure compliance with your process. To have the documented process, but you must make sure that your team members are all following it consistently. So if you can get it into a product that allows you to run analytics, you'll be able to take a really quick high-level look to make sure that they're following those proper timelines and following through with assigned cases. The 7 phases of investigation is the bulk of our focus here today. They are as follows: assessment, preparation and planning, information gathering. The 3rd phase is where the bulk of your work is going to come in. Moves on to verification and analysis, decision making, disbursement of disciplinary or corrective action, and ends with prevention or education. So starting with the assessment phase, this is where we're really going to get going on an investigation. The first question you want to ask when you have a complaint that comes through is this matter worthy of an investigation? An investigation means you're going to be pulling documents, talking to several individuals. If you're going to have to follow up with more than one person, in my book, that's considered an investigation. Certainly, your own organization can put guidelines on what constitutes an investigation and at what point this process needs to kick in. So how are you going to handle it when these complaints come in? Who's going to make that call on who's going to do the investigation? Some matters you're going to want to boot back to management. They're going to be the basic person to deal with it. It's not too high level of an issue, and you think that they can just talk to the person and get it worked out. Maybe it's just a payroll issue, or a glitch just has to be cleared up with another department. Those types of things we're going to want to go ahead and boot out to operations if we can. Now, if the matter comes in and it is worthy of an investigation, so we have a little bit more serious of an issue, employee misconduct, employees complaining about one another, then we're going to need to decide at what level it's going to be investigated. So is this something that we need HR to take care of? Is this more of an internal audit problem? Perhaps it falls under security. So it really just depends on how your organization is arranged to figure out what level is appropriate of investigation. During the assessment phase, we identify those who are most involved. So since you have a basic report, ideally, you are going to be able to identify who the reporting party is and who they're complaining about, 2 most important identities. Based on the information, sometimes we get more, sometimes we get less, you should be able to identify any potential direct witnesses or anybody else that may work in that group that could have information. Now, what happens when you get an anonymous complaint? So, if you get an anonymous complaint, just because there is no name on it, that does not mean you can ignore it. There's not a lot of case law that speaks to corporate investigations involving anonymous complaints. But as far as criminal investigations go, if the individual is able to provide enough information to give you some kind of context to the situation, then usually that's something that's followed up on. So in corporate investigations, general rule of thumb, you need to look at that anonymous complaint that comes in. If you have enough information where you can ask some questions, then you need to go ahead and ask those questions. Now, certainly, if it's anonymous, we're not going to go put everything out on the table and start accusing people, but it's enough information to just go maybe ask some general questions and see if those general questions pique any kind of interest or you get any kind of response that would lead you to open a full-blown investigation. We want to look at what policies or precedents may exist that can impact the investigation. So we want to pull any kind of policies that may be related to the alleged behavior. So are we talking about code of conduct here? Are we talking about ethical considerations? Are we talking about discrimination? We want to pull any of those policies that might relate. We also want to make sure that we're aware of any policies that might impact the actual investigation. So do we have union employees? Do we have to think about the right to representation? Do we have to think about retaliation? Do we have any company policies that state employees must participate or they could be subjected to disciplinary action? Those are the types of policies that we want to make sure as investigators we are well aware of so that we can give the proper disclosures when we are interviewing folks. Who else in the organization should be notified during this phase? We want to look at counsel. What kind of a matter is this? Is this something we want to escalate to the legal department and make sure that they have their hands in it? Do we want to let management know what's going on at this point? Are there any employees that we need to bring into the loop? Are there any other departments that we need to notify so that we can properly gather information? In this initial assessment phase, they definitely want to keep the number of people that are being notified to a minimum. Only those that need to know, and they only need to know what they need to know. So management may not need to know at this point who's involved in the investigation or even the context of it. But because you're going to be pulling people off a line and management has to get someone to fill those spots in order for operations to keep running, you may need to give them a heads up that, hey, we are looking into some concerns and you're going to need to have extra backup on these following days. Also, are there any parties external to their organization that should be notified? Depends on what the case is. Maybe we have to notify some vendors or contractors. Maybe we're going to have to speak to some of their employees. Do we have to notify the government? Do you have any statutory duties to report? It's going to depend on what kind of what the case matter is. Is it something where we need to notify the board of directors? What about the police? In the assessment phase, we often get clients asking us about notifying the police when the allegation is involving criminal behavior. We recommend against defaulting to getting the police involved. You should first conduct your own internal investigation and make your decisions of employment based on the findings of your internal investigation. If you would then like to turn that information over to the police for them to criminally investigate, that would be the appropriate time. There are a lot of issues that arise once we do get the police involved. Certainly, if there's a fear for any kind of safety or any kind of duty report, you absolutely, not suggesting to not do that. You should go to the police under those circumstances. But if it's something like theft, we would encourage that you do that internal investigation first. Your burden of proof is much lower, and as long as you make your decisions based on your investigation, you're going to be covered. If you start making decisions based on a police investigation, that could get you in some hot water down the line. The second phase is the planning and preparation phase. So these activities include obtaining management's commitment. So while we may not let management know everything that's going on, we do want to make sure they're committed. This is going to start way before any investigation ever begins. As HR, law department, internal audit, wherever you may sit, we need to make sure that we have positive relationships with management and that we can align as team members to really move forward to handle these issues as they come up. If management doesn't buy into what you're doing, that's going to come across to their employees, and the employees aren't going to buy into what you're doing. So really try to work on those relationships with management throughout your career with the organization. Now, specifically, we want to obtain their commitment to the specific investigation. So letting them know, hey, this is what we're planning on doing. This is our estimated timeline. This is how we think it may disrupt your operations. Let's talk about what we can do to make sure that's a minimum. Management is going to be most concerned with operations, money, product, and the end dollar. So try to be sensitive to that. You negotiate your objectives in the second phase. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in the next slide, as well as deciding what standard of proof will be pursued. This is where you're going to pull your necessary resources. So at this point, we have a general idea of what the complaint is. So who do we need to bring in on the team? Do we need to bring in someone from finance because it looks like we have a fraud investigation going on? Does it look like workplace violence and maybe we need some help from security? Or maybe you have a complaint about a most high-ranking individual in your organization, the CEO or some other C-level individual. In that case, you may want to actually consider going to an external third party. So there are a lot of different things to look at. Who's the accused? Who's the complainant? What role do they perform in the organization? How likely is this case to go to litigation? Is this a violation of company policy or a violation of federal law? The more serious claims are things that you may want to think about consulting out to a third party. After you pool those necessary resources, whether they be internal or external, you'll then want to identify who the decision makers are. Decision makers should not be the same as the fact finders. Fact finders are the person out there gathering the information, planning the investigation, and drawing the conclusions. The fact finders will then turn their conclusions over to the decision makers, who will then determine whether or not the behavior, the conclusions about the behavior, qualify some kind of disciplinary or corrective action, and what kind of disciplinary or corrective action. Decision makers are often going to be individuals maybe in HR, those higher level managers that are one or two levels removed from the actual situation, sometimes legal departments getting involved in that. Lastly, you want to establish a project plan and a delivery timeline. So you're just setting your general timeline. I'm going to need about X amount of days to gather my initial information. I project to speak to X amount of employees. Always give yourself some wiggle room because you never know what you're going to find out when speaking to these individuals. And then project about how long it's going to take you to actually get the information written up. Most investigations, most issues should be able to get wrapped up by interviewing 3 to 8 people. I'd say most of our investigations fall in that range. Sometimes it might explode into a little bit more. It depends on how many different issues that you're looking at. Depending on what your other caseload is, the ideal turnaround time would be a matter of a couple of weeks. Now, certainly, if somebody's complaining about behavior from multiple individuals that have spanned over the past 20 years that they've worked there, that's going to be a little more convoluted and possibly take a little bit more time. But just really take an objective look at your complaint, who you think you're going to talk to, and set that delivery timeline. When we're looking at our objectives, so you want to create your objectives at the beginning of every investigation. There are some standard universal objectives that we use in every single investigation. No matter what the content is, all these objectives will apply. So identifying the true nature and scope of the problem. We all know that when people make complaints, oftentimes what their focus of the complaint is may not really be what your main concern about the complaint is. So identifying the true nature and scope of the problem and cleaning out all the white noise from the complaining party is a real meaningful objective. We want to identify who was involved and why. Why is a piece that sometimes as investigators we forget. So we always want to know who was involved. We want to figure out, did they do that? Did they not do it? And once we figure out they did it, we're happy and we get the case closed. Why is a very crucial aspect. If we know why they're engaged in the behavior, we can figure out whether it's a systemic problem and whether we can make any changes in the work environment or in our processes and procedures to help ensure that it's not going to happen again in the future. So it's not just about putting out the fires, it's about putting out the fires and preventing them from reoccurring. Another good objective is collecting information to allow for the proper discipline or corrective action. So that's just making sure that you're gathering those policies at the beginning so that you can match any of the behaviors with these to see whether or not there are violations. And executing the investigation so that it's least disruptive to the organization. We all know that when we show up and start interviewing individuals, it's going to be disruptive, but we can take certain steps to limit disruption. And it really depends on the seriousness of the allegation as to how much we're going to be willing to work with that disruption. Having properly pooled resources is going to help you achieve a good return on investment. So you want to make sure that you have people appropriate. If you have, some of you guys may have a whole investigations team, so it's really a no-brainer. All the investigations go to that team. Other folks may have one HR generalist and really doesn't have anybody else helping them out. Well, in those situations, you definitely want to consider whether you need to use external resources to make sure you get it right the first time around. You should include an objective or two that is specific to the scope of the investigation as well. So something like investigation, I've been asked to investigate allegations of employee misconduct in the sales department, investigating allegations of differential treatment by Manager Jones. So those types of things are okay to get specific on. When you're listing out your objectives, try to stay away from legal terms, things like retaliation, theft, fraud, particularly if you're not an attorney. I myself am not an attorney, so I stay away from making any kind of legal conclusions. There's easy ways to get around it and wording it. Instead of retaliation, they're treating me differently. Instead of fraud, misappropriation of company assets. So there are a lot of ways to label it so that you don't get any kind of legal trouble. The last piece to that is the standard of proofs. So here we have 3 different standards of proof. The first one is beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's the standard of proof that we use in criminal investigations. It's about 99.9%. The second standard is preponderance of the evidence, and this is that 50% more likely than not. This is what's used in civil litigation. For us conducting internal investigations, in order to sustain employee discipline, all we have to do is conduct a good faith investigation and make a reasonable conclusion. That means we've just got to get a little bit out of the gate. As long as we have a sound process, follow that process, and come to a reasonable conclusion, we're going to be good. A lot of times, organizations will try to get to that preponderance of the evidence, that 51%, particularly if we're talking about violations of federal law, because they know that that's where it's going to go in the civil lawsuit. So that's okay to go ahead and bring it up to that, but beyond a reasonable doubt is just not a necessary standard of proof in internal investigations. The third phase, and again, this is where the bulk of our fact-finding is going to happen, is the information gathering phase. This is where we're going to combine different methods of investigations and deploy them in a very precise sequence. We have 6 methods of investigations that we sometimes use during the course of an investigation. I'm going to go through them all kind of high level. First and second methods, physical and electronic surveillance. Pretty basic, watching people, places, and things. Physical surveillance, actually physically watching those people and places, and electronic is really defaulting to using some kind of cameras or electronic devices. Electronic surveillance can also not only include cameras, but any kind of audit badging system or anything that's really used through technology. Electronic and physical surveillance should be conducted by experts. If you don't have experience doing physical surveillance, I do not recommend that you go out in a car and sit and check out a situation. It likely would not end well. I would recommend that you call up an expert to help you out with that side of it. Electronic surveillance, you probably have IT or security or someone internal that can help you out in reviewing that information. The third method, this is a method that we use in every investigation we undertake, is research and audit. So this is looking at documents. Research is referring to those external documents, so public domain documents, criminal records, asset records, Googling people, looking at their social media. That's what would fall under the research category. Audit is going to refer to those internal records that you look at. So some of the audit things that we pull in every investigation is personnel files, performance reviews, previous discipline, previous rewards. So those are the kind of things that you want to look at, gather out, and really kind of set a tone to get a good picture of the individuals that you're investigating. The fourth method is forensic analysis. We most commonly use this in the form of computer forensics. Computer forensics can be extremely helpful to an investigation, but it will come with a price tag. So you want to make sure that the investigation is serious enough that you're willing to pay that amount of money. Computer forensics will uncover almost any information if it is there to be found. I would encourage you not to default to using your internal IT staff unless they do have the forensics expertise. Oftentimes, once an individual from your organization, whether it's a manager, IT, starts going in there and trying to look for information, they're now compromising the evidence. So even if you eventually get it over to a computer forensic analyst, the evidence has already been compromised, and it'll be that much more difficult for them to use that to support you in a court case. The fifth phase is undercover. We don't ever use undercover. It's quite an archaic method. It's very costly, it's very lengthy, and we've found that we can just get just as good information using a combination of the other methods. The last method is interviewing. This is the most useful tool, but do not default to it. Frequently, investigators will forego all the other methods and move straight to interviews. They'll interview the reporting party, and then they'll interview the accused. What happens in that situation, oftentimes the reporting party will say, well, he did this. And then you get to the accused, and they said, no, I didn't. And then you're stuck with the he said, she said situation. The cat's already out of the bag. They know you've done the investigation. You've lost your surprise, the surprise tactic, and you're forced to go back and reinvestigate with everyone already knowing what's going on. It's important to gather as much data as you can prior to getting into interviews so that you can leverage that information and challenge individuals if what they're saying doesn't sound right or is contradictory. The information gathering phase, a couple of things to keep in mind. Confidentiality, who's going to know about this information? What are we going to allow them to have? How are we going to keep it quiet? The best way to keep the investigation quiet is to limit the number of people that you're exposing to it and to conduct your interviews in the shortest amount of time as possible. So it's okay to take a little bit of extra time at the beginning to plan out when you want to speak to people, to make sure they're not going to be on vacation, to make sure they're not away on any pre-scheduled business trips, so that you can really pound out all of the interviews in one day ideally. If it has to spread out over 2 days, that's fine, but don't let it go out over the weekend. We want to make sure that we're getting it in the shortest amount of time as possible. Advice of counsel, you do want to make sure that your counsel is aware when you're undergoing investigations, particularly that violate any kind of federal law or that you think might go to litigation, to see how they want to protect the information. And credibility determinations likely will come up when you're verifying the information that you learn in an interview. And credibility, we want to look at not only the credibility of the people we're interviewing, but also the credibility of the documents and the resources that we're getting information from. Now, this phase is not an end. Rather, it's a means to an end. The purpose of this phase is to gather all your data points necessary to then move the process to the next phase. An investigator should not move to the next phase until they can answer in the affirmative both of the following questions. 1, is the investigation sufficient? And 2, has the fact finder achieved the standard of proof selected? If you can say yes to both of those, then we'll go ahead and move to the next phase. If you cannot, we need to go back to our methods and we need to pull more information. You do not go into that fourth phase without being 95% sure that you have the information and that you know whether or not the claim has been substantiated. Once we know the claim is being substantiated, we'll move to the verification and analysis phase. This is where our investigatory interviews take place. These are a little bit different than our administrative interviews in that we know these people are involved and we've already drawn a preliminary conclusion that the behavior has been substantiated based on our other data points. The point of this interview is to yield an admission. So we're going to ask questions in a different way. We're going to use different interviewing techniques to ensure that we get an admission. Unlike criminal law, we don't need a bunch of evidence to support our conclusion. An admission is all that we need. So when you get someone to agree that they engaged in the behavior, that is as good as gold. That's as good as the smoking gun in a criminal investigation. Be aware that there may be some mitigating circumstances. So by the time you get to the accused, you may think you have it all figured out, and they may provide completely new information that changes your conclusion and changes your perception, and that's okay. Oftentimes that will lead to some additional investigation. You'll want to go ahead and loop around and make sure you confirm the information that they share with you in order to properly close out your case. Lastly, you do want to make sure that the accused individual reveals any other information regarding other people's involvement, and again, the why. That why piece is so crucial. For example, I have an example of a case that we worked where there was a bunch of manufacturing equipment that was consistently getting damaged. So the company asked us to come in and see if we could identify who was damaging the property. Through a series of interviews and using some electronic surveillance as well as research and audit, we were able to identify 2 individuals that were primarily responsible for damaging the equipment. We got them in a room and they admitted to engaging the behavior. Luckily, we bothered to ask the why question. When we asked why they were breaking the equipment, we were told that their manager was often requiring that they work overtime, but was only giving them an hour or two that overtime. Their jobs were being threatened that if they didn't stay, they would be fired. Many of these individuals working at this manufacturing facility were single mothers and had childcare arrangements that they had to deal with. Because this one individual wasn't able to accommodate to get her child taken care of, she would sabotage the equipment so that she could go home. She was not unwilling to work overtime. She just needed more advance notice. So having an understanding of that why, the employee was still disciplined for engaging in the behavior. I mean, you can't go around breaking equipment and not be held responsible for it. But the corporation was being given information so that they could change how they were assigning overtime to make sure that these women could get additional child care, work the overtime, get the money, but still have their personal needs taken care of, and they didn't have that issue anymore of sabotaging equipment. A couple of things to think about in interviews. Going to go through this pretty high level. You always want to first and foremost consider your safety. If you are not comfortable or do not feel safe going into a room with an individual, do not do it. You can always bring security with you. You can always contract out to a third party to help you out that can deal with those types of issues. Think about the location and timing of the interview. You want the location to be convenient but not obvious. So we don't want it to be in a main thoroughfare, but we also don't want the person to have to get on a bus and go across town to get to your other side of campus. So try to keep it in the same building of where the person's located. Prefer not to do them in people's offices. If you do it in HR's office or if you do it in the employee's office, there'll be some kind of position of power that can be difficult to overcome when you're trying to build rapport. My preferred place to do it is in a neutral conference room. The conference room can have windows, but if it does, it definitely needs to have blinds so that we can shut them. We want to make sure that nobody's distracted on the inside or the outside by what's going on. Timing of interviews, just want to think about it not falling over a weekend. If you are going to have an investigation that you think might result in termination, recommendation is to really get that investigation solid at the beginning of the week. We prefer not to terminate folks on a Friday because then they go into the weekend and don't have access to resources to ask questions, and there's just the potential for them to get aggravated and a potential for a bad situation. So if you can terminate someone more on a Tuesday or Wednesday, then they still have several days to call, unemployment, to talk to HR, to talk to any any kind of employee assistance program, and those types of resources. We do have witnesses in all of our interviews, so we have a second chairperson that sits to make sure that we're getting everything properly documented, and we do take notes during all of our interviews, and if we get an admission, we do record that stuff in a written statement. Fifth phase, the decision-making phase. This is the responsibility of those decision makers that we pre-established in phase 2. So in phase 2, we decided who would participate. Typically, the decision-making phase will be prompted with some kind of verbal debrief, so some kind of initial debrief of what the findings of the investigation are, and should be followed up with a written report. If you don't have an admission, as the investigator, you're weighing the credibility and drawing the conclusions of whether it's substantiated or not, and then the decision makers are just going to determine whether or not that behavior is violation of company policy. Decision makers should be consistent with company policy and past practices. It's okay to deviate a little bit from past practices. You don't have to treat an employee who's only been there for 6 months the same as an employee who's been with the organization for 20 years when they both engaged in the same policy violation. They can have different disciplinary action, but you just want to make sure that you're documenting this is a little bit different and why you're making those decisions. The sixth phase is disciplinary and corrective action. Not always necessary, but if you do determine there's policy violation or any kind of opportunity for improvement, that's when this is going to go ahead and be dispensed. Responsibility is of the decision makers to identify what kind of discipline or corrective action should be dispensed, and then hand it over to typically human resources and management. We would recommend that if no matter who's giving the disciplinary action, to have a second witness in the room. Most importantly, document. You have got to document this discipline, preferably digitally. We all know that when you have those hard copy files, you put a piece of paper in someone's file, you go back to it a year later, and you say, I swear Larry was written up for this previously, but you can't find that piece of paper. So in order to protect your process, to protect your audit trail, and to make sure that people can't just remove information, if you digitally document it, it's going to be a lot harder for individuals to change that information. And documenting it is going to make it much easier for you to search those records. So when you say, I swear Larry got in trouble about this a year ago, you should be able to just pull up his name in your technology or your case management system, and it'll very easily alert you to whether or not he's been previously involved in investigations and what his previous discipline was. The last phase is our education and prevention phase, and this is the least utilized phase, and it's one of the most important. Experience has shown that if lessons learned are not leveraged, workplace issues will reappear and repeat themselves. So if we understand that answer to the why question, why are they engaging in this behavior, hopefully we can take that information, identify best practices, and then educate our employees so that we can prevent these from happening again in the future. Ways to avoid litigation or to better protect yourself in the case that a case does go to litigation. The most important piece is documenting. I don't know if I said that word enough in this presentation, so I'll say it a few more times. Document everything. Sometimes there's an argument of whether you should be documenting hard copy or electronic file, whether the information is more discoverable in a certain depending on the way that you document it. It's going to be it's potentially discoverable whether it's hard copy or electronic file. Hard copy, you have the potential to lose stuff, and it's a lot easier to alter the information. If you're documenting things electronically, it's going to be very easy to reference the information and to show consistency if you do, in fact, have to go to litigation. So we all know what happens when you get an EEOC complaint. You're going to get a letter from them, and they're going to ask you a bunch of questions. They're going to ask you, how many times has this kind of issue previously come up? How many times has it come up in this department? How many times has it come up in your company? Well, how are you going to pull all that information together? If everything you have is hard copy, you're going to be pulling a lot of files and having a lot of admin time going into it. If you have a nice, competent technology system, you should be able to just go into that system, pull up certain issues, and get a complete docket of everything that you need to know to respond to that EEOC complaint. Couple of other things to avoid litigation. Make sure that you are consistent with precedents and past practices, and if you are going to vary from that past practice, do have it clearly documented. Have your information organized in a case management system for ease of use and audit trail. Obey the law should be a no-brainer, but sometimes we do have to remind that and make sure that our behavior is ethical. Team consult, and most importantly, follow your process consistently. We do have, that's about all that we have over the 7 phases to conducting a workplace investigation. This was an extremely high-level overview of it, but we wanted to give you guys an idea of what we go through the course of our investigations. If you're interested in some additional resources, we do have a white paper with a link attached here in the presentation. And I'm sure that you noticed throughout the presentation that there were some screenshots of some technology to assist with the process. And Convercent does offer a case management system. The case management system has full hotline incident management, reporting and auditing, and investigation management. So if you're interested in seeing more how technology can help you out with your process, you can check out this link or give us a call. We do have demos available. We do have a few upcoming webinars, so frequently check our website so you can make sure to sign up and not miss any of them. Our next one is going to be focused on how technology can be used to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of your investigation process. Look for a follow-up email with registration information. If you do engage in any technology contract with Convercent, you will receive 3 months free service. So be sure to mention that you attended this webinar so you can get that discount. And as always, our professional services staff is available here as a resource. So whether you just want to bounce some ideas off someone or need an external investigation, we are here to support you with that. I really appreciate your time today. I think I got through the information pretty good time here, so we do have about 10-15 minutes left for questions. If you haven't typed them in throughout the presentation, go ahead and feel free to type them in now. And I'm going to pull some up and see if I can't get a few things answered. All right, first question. You said a C-level individual is a time to consider a third party. What other factors should lead to engaging a third party? So most commonly the things that we look at are what level is that accused individual at? So is there any individual in your organization that can conduct an unbiased investigation? Now, I know as investigators, that's our job. We're objective, unbiased investigators, but you have to look at how it looks to the outside world. So also, if you have somebody who's being accused of inappropriate behavior and they're in HR and that's your main investigative staff, it would be unlikely that an outside eye would think anybody could be unbiased in that approach. So that might be a good idea to get a third party in. Also, if it's just above your level of expertise. So again, say you're a smaller organization and you have one individual that is the HR generalist and you have some kind of fraud situation going on, or maybe you have some kind of computer forensic stuff. So it depends on the level of expertise needed to actually gather the information. And if it is above your level, that also would be a good time to get a third party involved. For an anonymous complaint, if the information provided is insufficient, would you ask for more information? If you can, absolutely. So I guess it depends on how the anonymous complaint comes in. If you get a letter under your door, probably going to be pretty difficult to follow up with that person because you're not going to know whose door to put your questions back through. If you have information coming through a hotline system, most hotline systems or some hotline systems do offer the opportunity to talk to the reporting party regardless of whether they're anonymous or not. So if you have that kind of good technology on your side, use that system, respond to them. Hey, I know that you made this complaint. I have a couple more questions that I need answers so that I can thoroughly. If they never respond, you did your due diligence and you're covered in that case. You're giving them the opportunity to respond. So the only other way I would go about asking for more information is, say you have a complaint that just generally complains about a manager. So he's just mean to people. You know who the manager is, so you know who he manages. You don't have to go and tell people that there was a complaint and what the source of the complaint was. But as HR, you could go in and just kind of do a temperature check. Call a couple of people in from the department and say, hey, just checking in. Want to make sure that you guys are happy. Do you have any concerns with your work environment? Is there anything you want to share? Talk to 2 or 3 people. If everyone says no problems, everything's good, that's due diligence. You've done enough to satisfy that with the information you had, you tried to look and found nothing. Another question. Okay, good. Can you use the technology to follow up after an investigation? So following up with a person, or maybe the disciplinary action, I'm guessing might be the source of the question. So yeah, it depends on the kind of technology you have. If you do have some kind of integrated system, or maybe you have the hotline system where you can at least just communicate, it's good to have that documented. Whether you're literally communicating with the reporting party and telling them through the system that the investigation has been wrapped up, or the preferred method is to do it one-on-one with the person, and then you're just documenting that conversation in the system. If you have an integrated system, or if you have e-learning, or maybe some kind of policy management, then you could also send out the corrective action through there. So you can give them a policy that they need to review, or you can require that they go through a training. The question is, my company is a new startup, and we don't have a lot of documented process and procedure. Is technology still something we should consider? Absolutely. Most technology products you can manipulate slightly or make it fit what it needs to work for you. The technology in and of itself is going to give you some kind of backbones to give you some kind of consistency and make sure that everyone is doing everything the same. Question is, can you talk more about why you would not use or why you would stay away from legal terms? And this, again, refers to those who are not lawyers. We don't want to draw a legal conclusion. If we start saying or concluding that somebody is a thief, somebody retaliated, or somebody engaged in fraud, those are terms that come with a certain standard of proof. So if your report ever gets to the point of litigation, that's something that they're going to harp on. And so some of these things may seem little, but when you go to litigation, it's not really about whether or not you had a sound conclusion. They're going to attack your process. They're going to attack every little word that they use, and they're going to challenge of whether or not you're authorized to be making those kinds of conclusions. So if we stick to our conclusions to confirming, to substantiating or not substantiating behavior, that's going to keep it cleanest for us if down the road it goes to some kind of litigation. So again, instead of substantiating that this person retaliated against someone, I would substantiate it that when this person after this person participated in an investigation, their manager began treating them differently in the following ways. So I'm still reaching the same conclusion, but not using legal terms. Okay. Is it advisable to inform the subject of the identity of the witnesses? And what if they ask? No. We want to protect everyone's confidentiality. Now, there are certain cases where the identity is going to be obvious. So if you have a case where a very specific person is complaining about a very specific situation and there were no witnesses to that situation, your subject's going to figure it out. Even though your subject's going to figure it out, I try to stay away from providing that information to them. So you can always ask questions in a way that allows your subject to bring forward the information. If they ask, well, how do you know? Well, who are your witnesses? Well, who said that to you? You do not have to answer those questions. When somebody asks you that question, that in fact is a sign of deception. When they're saying, well, prove it to me. Well, tell me where'd you get that evidence? Let me see that evidence. That's a sign that they're probably were engaging in the behavior. My response to that is, at this point in time, I actually don't have to show you the evidence that I have. What I can tell you is that I received evidence, or I have several complaints, or I've talked to several people, and this is what they've said. So you can provide the information without identifying who the witnesses are. We want to try and protect those witnesses. In the long run, we're really trying to protect from any retaliation claims. If your subject never knows who the witnesses were, it's going to be more difficult for them to make a retaliation claim after the fact. But again, it's just we want our witnesses to feel comfortable. We want them to be able to come to us in future situations and not think that we're going to sell them out. There's a question about retention records. So what is the standard for retention for investigation files? We retain our records for 7 years unless it's been put on any kind of litigation notice. If you've been put on any kind of notice that there may be litigation, you do have to keep those records indefinitely. So this is where it's helpful as far as our electronic files, is that we can put an automatic purge on things that are going to, that once they hit the 7-year mark, they automatically purge, unless we're putting some kind of legal hold on it. If an employee finds out about an investigation prior to interviews or fact-finding is finished, how should this situation be handled? Okay, this is a good question. If an employee finds out, then that means your circle of confidentiality has been breached. So somebody is leaking the information, and it's most likely going to be a member of management. Hopefully it's not a member of your investigative team. If you know an employee has found out, you need to address that individual. I'm not sure how you would come across that information, so there's a lot of context with this what if that could make it go into different directions, but I wouldn't ignore it. If you know an employee found out and you're ready to start interviews the following day, that's close enough where you probably can just let it go. But if you're in the middle of fact-finding and you're not going to start interviewing for at least another week, you need to pull that employee in. Say that I understand you have some information, or that you're aware that we're looking into some concerns. I'd like to take some time to talk to you about that. Then you can talk to that person about confidentiality and go ahead and interview them and see if they have any information to add. And then you can ask them to keep the information confidential. Are they going to? We don't know. But you have a more likely chance of them keeping it confidential if you address it straight on than if you let them just kind of go and have it with the rumor mill. Okay, there's a question about under phase 4, please elaborate on request for representation. I definitely went over that quickly. I thought I was a little short on time, so I'd be happy to expand on it now. Request for representation mostly is going to refer to those union environments. So under Weingarten, if the interview or information they shared during your interview may result in disciplinary action, they have the right to have a union rep present. They don't have a right to have a union rep talk for them, but they have a right to have that person present in the room. When we're dealing with union environments, we always give people that option. I know that I'm not doing anything wrong, so I never have any problem with another person being in the room. Some organizations tighten that hold a little bit more. Maybe they don't have as good of a relationship with their union, and so then they only articulate that option to the employee if they believe that there could be some kind of disciplinary action. Now, the other side of representation most people are probably thinking about is attorneys. Employees do not have the right to have an attorney present during an internal investigation. It is just that, an internal investigation. It is not a criminal matter. Due process rights do not apply in internal investigations. Now, if cases go to litigation, jurors prefer that you give people some kind of due process. So if somebody does request to have a lawyer, usually my workaround with that is to let them know I'm not an attorney, I don't have a lawyer present. We would ask that they not either, that they're more than welcome to take notes during our conversation. And if at any point they feel uncomfortable and would like to take a break to consult with their attorney, we certainly would allow that to happen. And usually when you give people those options, I'm going to say 99% of the time, they usually go with it and keep talking. People are curious and they want to know what's going on. And so they usually continue to engage in the interview process. And then last question, I think that we'll be able to get in for the end of the time. When an investigation is inclusive, how do you wrap it up Oh, inconclusive. How do you wrap it up and communicate with those involved? Okay, so when we have a case that is not substantiated, that's what it is. That's the conclusion. When you follow up with the individuals, especially the reporting party, they probably pretty strongly believed what was happening was happening. There's a difference between something that is unfounded versus something that is not substantiated, right? Unfounded is we investigated and find that it did not happen like that. Unsubstantiated could be more, well, we did the investigation and we don't have enough information to conclude that it did happen. So we're defaulting to unsubstantiated. So I would handle those a little bit differently. If it's unfounded, you definitely need to address that head on especially with the reporting party, because they will continue to focus on this individual and likely will bring forward more complaints. So you do want to have some loop around, explain to them that there has been a thorough investigation conducted. We never tell them what the outcome is, in the sense that we're never going to tell them what kind of disciplinary action or corrective action was taken, because that's confidential information. But what you can do is address them and say, hey, we conducted an investigation, we've looked into all these different matters, and we've concluded it, appropriate action is being taken. If you have any other concerns or notice anything else, X is the appropriate avenue to report that, and please continue to communicate with me as we go along. Go ahead and follow up with that individual after a couple of months and make sure that everything's going okay, and that they don't have any other concerns. Okay, well, that brings us to the end. I really appreciate everyone joining. If we didn't answer your question, we will address it in our follow-up slides, or you can feel free to give us a call and consult with anybody. Again, thank you so much for attending. Check out our website so that you can get some more information about our upcoming webinars, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. Have a good day.